Opening the center immediately, this thrust aims to seize early initiative and influence pawn structure. Opens a diagonal for the queen and bishop, aiming for dynamic counterplay rather than direct pawn engagement. Developing the knight towards the center prepares for d4 and exerts pressure on black's queenside. Opening the path for the bishop and solidifying central control, d6 skillfully balances active piece development with defensive integrity. Opening the center now confronts the Sicilian's asymmetry, creating immediate tactical possibilities. Initiating a strategic pawn exchange, black opens lines for active piece play and challenges white's central control, setting the stage for dynamic middle game complications. Unleashing a central pawn storm, white claims crucial space while black's pawn structure faces immediate scrutiny. Asserting central presence, this knight prepares to challenge white's pawn structure and develop further. Developing the knight to c3 bolsters the central pawn structure and prepares for kingside castling. Securing the b5 square and preparing for the eventual b5 advance adds a subtle yet important layer to black's queenside ambitions. Unleashing the pawn storm aggressively aims to dominate the center and initiate an attacking campaign, though it does open lines towards your own king and requires careful defense of that sector. Preparing to challenge the center and support queenside expansion, this maneuver aims to centralize the queen while also eyeing potential pawn breaks or piece deployments on the c-file or even down the b-file. A subtle repositioning to prepare for central pawn thrusts or a potential kingside initiative, now that the knight has retreated from the central skirmish, aiming to support a broader pawn structure or even facilitate a later development of the queen's bishop to a more active diagonal. Securing the knight on a more central square, this allows for future kingside development and potentially eyeing the center. The piece gains a stronger outpost, ready to support pawn breaks or participate in an attack. It also discourages any immediate aggressive pushes by white's d-pawn, maintaining a solid pawn structure. Developing the bishop to a more active diagonal, preparing to castle and connect the rooks, while also looking to control the d5 square. Aggressively expanding on the queenside, black seeks to gain space and potentially prepare a pawn storm or open lines for the queenside pieces, while white might look to consolidate central control and develop a kingside attack. The king's flank suddenly feels exposed. A consequence of the pawn advances, and this cautious advance seeks to prevent black's aggressive b-pawn from advancing further and disrupting white's structure. Preparing a fianchetto for the bishop offers a solid defensive structure against white's kingside aggression, potentially aiming to control the long diagonal and hinder white's immediate pawn pushes. Embracing the safety of the king becomes paramount after this maneuver, securing it on its new, sheltered square. This often allows white to reorient his pieces for a more dynamic central presence, preparing to contest key squares or launch an attack that was previously hampered by an exposed monarch. The immediate threat of a kingside assault recedes, permitting a more considered buildup of forces. Black harmonizes their pieces, bringing the bishop to an active diagonal where it stares down white's queenside and potentially supports a future b4 push, while also safeguarding the king. Shifting the queen to e1 aims to support a potential kingside pawn storm, likely targeting black's kingside weaknesses after the fianchetto, while also preparing to redeploy the knight from f3 to a more active square, perhaps g3 or h4, to increase pressure. Developing the bishop to b7 strategically repositions this piece to exert pressure along the long diagonal, potentially targeting white's queenside pawns or offering support for future pawn advances. Securing the king's safety, this seemingly quiet maneuver opens up avenues for the rook to become active later, perhaps along the newly cleared h-file, while also preventing any immediate pesky knight forks that might have been brewing on g3. Unleashing the central pawn creates a dynamic confrontation, challenging white's knight and aiming to seize initiative. Black boldly sacrifices a tempo to break open the position, potentially disrupting white's queenside pawn structure and opening lines for the rooks. This aggressive maneuver signals a desire to avoid passive defense and dictate the game's tempo. Unleashing the queen aggressively, White aims to exploit the slight awkwardness of black's pawn structure and potential king exposure. Initiating a direct confrontation on the king side, black bravely challenges white's attacking aspirations by forcing the queen's retreat. This move preempts any immediate kingside storm white might have envisioned, creating crucial breathing room. However, it also subtly weakens the dark squares around the black king, potentially becoming a target later if white can reorganize effectively. The ensuing positional play will revolve around who can best exploit this newly established tension. Cracking open the center with that pawn capture immediately injects dynamism, creating a more open board where knight activity around the king could become a significant concern for black if not handled carefully. Seizing the open file, black reclaims the pawn and initiates a central pawn structure adjustment that opens avenues for the queen. A quiet regrouping, this bishop retreat aims to reinforce the d4 square, perhaps anticipating a future pawn push or simply repositioning for a more active role later in the game while maintaining its watch on the long diagonal. Initiating a pawn storm on the queen side with nc5 aims to disrupt white's coordinated pieces and potentially open lines for black's own attacking potential, though it risks creating structural weaknesses on the dark squares if white can exploit them. Asserting control over the central open file, white repositions the rook to a more active square, preparing to potentially double rooks or support a central pawn push. Unleashing the pawn storm with a dramatic pawn thrust, black chooses to inject immediate dynamism into the center by advancing the g-pawn, aiming to disrupt white's delicate piece positioning and seize greater control over the vital e4 square, while simultaneously creating potential tactical opportunities for the queen and bishop. The queen repositions, now eyeing the central dark squares and potentially supporting a d5 advance to challenge black's kingside pawn structure. Initiating a daring knight sortie, black aims to disrupt white's queenside structure and potentially create attacking chances on the kingside by forcing the queen to relocate. The queen's repositioning to g4 strategically intensifies pressure on the kingside, preparing for potential skirmishes and aiming to exploit the currently open g-file, while also creating a dynamic standoff with black's knight on h5 and indirectly bolstering the pawn chain. Diving into the enemy's central dark squares with the knight creates an immediate imbalance, questioning white's pawn structure and potentially opening lines towards the king. Opening the g-file presents immediate and significant pressure on black's castled king. The knight's excursion to f4, while appearing aggressive, now leaves the king's path quite exposed after the pawn exchange, opening a new aggressive diagonal for the white queen. The knight, suddenly liberated from the pawn chain's embrace, swoops into the center, a bold claim for central influence and a direct threat against the pinned knight on c5 and the soon-to-be-exposed king. This sudden injection of a central piece injects a jolt of tactical energy into the position. White is no longer content with slow maneuvering. There's a clear intention to disrupt black's harmony and create concrete attacking chances, particularly targeting the d5 square, which is crucial for controlling central squares and potentially opening lines. Consider the geometric implications of this knight's placement. It now dictates squares both offensively and defensively, potentially forcing concessions from black and dictating the future development of white's pieces. The board's dynamism has shifted dramatically with this aggressive centralization. Sacrificing the bishop here unravels the center, but consider the subsequent tempo gained and the pressure it instantly creates on white's awkwardly placed queen, potentially forcing it into a less secure square. Unleashing the full potential of the d-file, this recapture immediately forces black's king into a precarious central outpost, disrupting any semblance of cohesive defense and opening pathways for white's queen and rooks. Shifting the king to f8 shores up a defensive weakness, though it abandons the d-file, potentially creating future pressure for white's rooks if black isn't careful about piece coordination. A bold attempt to seize queenside space, aiming to dislodge black's centralized knight and open lines for the rook. The knight's relocation to d3, after being captured, is a pivotal moment, fundamentally altering the pawn structure and potentially leaving the king exposed to long-range threats. This exchange seems to simplify the position but opens up avenues for black to exploit the weakened d-file, and the absence of the knight on c3 might allow for more dynamic knight play from black in the future. Observe how the queenside structure is now less cohesive, potentially leading to opportunities for black to create breakthroughs or launch a direct assault on white's monarch. Opening the c-file creates immediate pressure against black's undeveloped queenside. Seeking to untangle the knights and free the d-pawn, black redirects the queen, aiming to disrupt white's increasingly cramped queenside structure and perhaps prepare for an eventual rd8 initiative. The white queen repositions, surveying the tangled structure, now aiming to exploit the weakened light squares around black's monarch. Initiating a counteroffensive along the open files, black aims to disrupt white's queenside pawn structure and potentially create attacking chances against the king. Unleashing a pawn storm into the enemy camp, 25. d6 aims to disrupt black's queenside structure and open avenues for white's pieces, specifically targeting the weak squares around the black king while simultaneously threatening to advance further and create a passed pawn. The rook's placement on the open d-file is a crucial development, aiming to challenge white's central pawn structure and potentially create counterplay against the exposed white king. Repositioning the rook to the 7th rank creates immediate pressure on black's uncastled monarch, simultaneously threatening to sever communication between the king and queen and control an open file for potential infiltration. Black finally tackles the immediate threat, seeking to dislodge the intrusive rook from the 7th rank and activate their own rook. But this concession of the d-file may prove a critical positional weakness for the rest of the game. The rook now occupies the open e-file, a crucial central artery, poised to exert pressure and potentially disrupt black's pawn structure. Consolidating defensive pressure around the king is the immediate objective, as the rook on e7 now poses a significant threat to capture pieces on the 3rd rank. Gaining control of the e-file is paramount, and this knight maneuver, while seemingly aggressive, creates a new defensive focus for black's monarch. The knight's presence on h4 invites tactical complications, potentially forcing concessions or creating weaknesses in black's pawn structure. It highlights the tension between aggression and king safety, a recurring theme in this dynamic Sicilian battle. White is gambling on disrupting black's harmony rather than immediate material gain, seeking to exploit any misstep in the upcoming exchanges. A bold pawn sacrifice to open lines, but the queen now finds itself a target, potentially leading to a rapid exchange and an advantageous endgame for white. Reclaiming the open e-file with the knight provides a solid retreat for the piece, allowing it to redeploy to a more active square or support an eventual kingside advance, while also preventing black's rook from easily penetrating further along the 7th rank. This daring recaptures a pawn and aims to disrupt white's central control, but it leaves black's king dangerously exposed on the kingside and opens up avenues for white's rooks. Instigating a pawn storm on the kingside, this aggressive thrust aims to pry open lines against the black monarch, potentially exposing weaknesses created by the earlier pawn advances. Black ignites activity on the queenside by liberating the bishop to the active diagonal, a bold attempt to counter white's imposing central pawn presence and the rook's infiltration. Unleashing the rook offers a bold attack on the unprotected king, aiming to exploit the weakened kingside pawn structure after the recent exchanges and white's aggressive pawn push on the queenside. Seizing the open file with the rook offers immediate tactical possibilities, threatening a devastating discovery against the king if white isn't careful, but it simultaneously leaves the g7 bishop somewhat exposed and potentially isolated from the defensive structure. The knight's daring lunge to e5 injects immediate dynamism, threatening both the bishop on f8 and the pawn on g6, while simultaneously opening a diagonal for the queen. This isn't just about a single threat. It's a repositioning that creates a multitude of tactical possibilities and forces black to react decisively to avoid significant material loss or a collapsing kingside. Abandoning the active, yet precarious, defense of the king in the face of white's encroaching rook seems like a necessary concession to avoid immediate disaster, prioritizing the safety of the monarch over a potentially futile counterplay. Reasserting pressure, The knight's repositioning creates a delightful tactical knot for black to untangle. The black queen, now occupying a precarious central position, aims to disrupt white's newly established knight outpost on d7 and simultaneously prepare for potential counterplay against the exposed white king. The queen slides over, aiming to disrupt the beleaguered king's sanctuary and capitalize on the compromised kingside. Unleashing the rook onto the third rank creates a cascade of potential threats, aiming to dismantle white's already precarious defensive setup. This audacious repositioning immediately targets the uncastled king and seeks to exploit the weakened pawn structure on the kingside, turning a defensive posture into a daring offensive thrust that might just catch the opponent off guard. This queen repositioning is a crucial moment to assess the king's safety and the long-term consequences of the pawn structure. Black finally addresses the unprotected king, bringing a crucial piece back to its defense. But this tactical retreat from the queenside offers white an immediate opportunity to exploit the newly opened diagonal.